This is lecture number 4, right? Are we 5? Lecture number 5, it goes on and on and on. Franciscans and Buddhist monks. And we're now focusing. I went to try to make parallels with the rule, and it was difficult because just the way it's stated. Our rule is a little bit easier to understand because it simply says, don't take life, don't steal, don't have sex, things like that. It's very straightforward in that sense. And the Franciscan rule, the first part of it spends a great deal of time talking about being devoted to Jesus and through Jesus to God and things like that. And the implication there for the Buddhist monks, of course, is to be devoted to the Buddha through the Buddha's teaching, as opposed to the Buddha, because of course the Buddha was not a divinity any more than we are, and he was a divinity just as we are. So that could cause a little confusion or rocking of the boat between the Franciscans, but generally we don't bring up those parallels. I did talk about the 5 precepts that a Buddhist in every Buddhist country except Japan takes, and the 10 precepts that a novice takes. We went over those already in every country but Japan. And then I went over the 10, actually they call it 16 precepts for becoming a Buddhist, and also exactly the same precepts are given for becoming a monk. And if we have to talk, what is the difference between those two? Well, one is that when you become a monk, you get your head shaved. Boys and girls both get their head shaved. Now, historically, there are some exceptions to that, but only with Americans. You know, Americans who went to Japan and said, oh, no, I'm not going to cut my hair. And for whatever reason, they were allowed to get away with it, but in the Buddhist world, when you become a monk, you shave your hair. Whether you're a man or a woman, you shave your head. And this is a tradition that comes from India, from at least 4,000 years ago, where people would, in the last stage of their life, the Indians divide life into 3 stages, and the last stage is spiritual development. And of course, they're only talking about men, because that's the way things were there for a long time, until Indira Gandhi, who bust that bubble for him about what women were capable of doing as she led India. But the leaving of home is still practiced, going off and giving up all the comforts and the things that you would have at home, the support you would have at home, the security that you would have at home. Because you know, for most people, they know that sometime during the day they're going to get a meal at home, and if they get sick, somebody will take them to the doctor. If their clothes get torn and ragged, somebody will provide them with new ones. With a monk, they are completely, or an ascetic, a searcher, they are completely at the whim of the public. If somebody wants to give them something to wear so that they're not naked, then they would get it. They can go and beg for their meals. So in Japan, what happened? That's the big question. And when did it happen? And I've always been curious about that. I got to clear my oxygen line here. Okay. I've always been curious about that, and it didn't immediately present itself what was going on. So we have to go a long ways back in Japan and figure out, well, when did this stuff change? And I really don't know if the last talk I gave, I went over this, because when I talk, I don't memorize what I say. But I did mention last time, I said that Buddhism came into Japan from Korea, and that there were some initial schools that came in. I guess I did go over it, and I mentioned Saicho, who was the founder of the Japanese school of Tendai, which is almost identical to the Chinese school of Thien An. They almost sound the same. And for some reason, I don't know what the reason was, but he decided that the important precepts to keep were the Bodhisattva precepts. And not only did he decide that the important precepts to keep were the Bodhisattva precepts, he decided only the cardinal 10. There's no mention of the 48 precepts. When I became a Buddhist officially, I did it in a Japanese temple, and I was given the Bodhisattva precepts, which to the Japanese consisted of taking the refuges, the 3 refuges, and also a declaration by the Buddha said that all Buddhists say this, they dedicate themselves to the enlightenment and support of all beings, etc. And that's another 3, and then we have the 10 precepts, which are kind of, sort of similar to the 5 precepts, kind of, sort of, but they're really the Bodhisattva precepts. We don't have anything about becoming angry in the 5 precepts. We don't have anything about not slandering the Buddha or slandering the Sangha in the 5 precepts. So there is a difference. What's unique about it is that there's really only, if you would, you could say there's only 2 ordinations in Japanese school. And the first ordination is because, and they look at it like this, they consider, and I guess we should too, you really can't become a Buddhist monk in any tradition without becoming a Buddhist first. You have to take those 5, and those 5 are the most important precepts, even though throughout the world some schools have 227 precepts for fully ordained, another school has 248, the Dharmagupta school, which is the set we follow, has 250. They all cover the same stuff. It's not like, oh, they've got more, so they do more. No, they just divide them out a little bit. Women have to keep 348 in the East. In here, in my school, not my school, but in my temple, and my teacher's temple, women kept the same precepts that men did. From the beginning, they kept the 250. Because if you sit down and compare them, line for line, in reality, the women are keeping no more precepts than the men are. They just break them into little pieces. And then, of course, the women will talk about the 8 restrictions that they had, which is a theme for another talk at another time. So we have Saicho, and Saicho says we don't need to keep those precepts, they're old-fashioned. And that's another talk too about old-fashioned and what that means. But he said we need to keep the Bodhisattva precepts. Now, that's what he said. And when the ordination takes place for a layman or a monk, and remember now, there's 2 ordinations, that's it. Anything that comes after that is not an ordination. We were talking in Dharma class today about certificates and things for monks. Those are not recognitions of ordination. Those are like you got promoted to be the manager of the warehouse where you worked. And so the boss says, okay, I'm going to give you a new name tag. It says, Bob Smith, manager of the warehouse. It's not an ordination, it's a recognition. And so in Japan, there are 7 levels of recognition. And I have to clarify that Saicho got rid of the Vinaya, the rules of the monk's life, yet the monks in Japan continued to follow the rules of the monk's life. It's a little confusing. But if you look at their lifestyle and what they did down to modern times, they were following the rules of the monk's life. They just didn't officially take them. They even mentioned the Vinaya at times. I'm being careful about following the Vinaya. Although they're not officially required at their ordination to keep it, but they're required by the community of monks to keep it. Is that confusing? Okay. Well, a lot of times the Japanese monks didn't call it the Vinaya. They said, well, this is what a monk does, this is what a monk doesn't do. If you're going to be a monk, you have to do it this way. Okay, they're still being confronted with it. It's interesting that in Japan, I think it was Rikyu, but don't even try to use that word. There was a school for a long time, the Vinaya school, where they spent a great deal of time talking about the monks' rules and making sure they were observed. So what I want to talk about today is one of the reasons I think that the Japanese school is so attractive. And when I say Japanese school, I'm talking about Zen. I'm sure there are a few people that practice Pure Land Buddhism in America, but they're a very small minority. It's just like, Tina Turner with Soka Gakkai, which is an offshoot of one of the Pure Land schools, completely a lay movement. They broke away from the priests and the Nichiren school, so they don't even have ministers. They don't have clergy anymore. They just simply have the practice of reciting the name of the Lotus Sutra. So, and that's kind of an aberration. But here's what happened. Monks were celibate. Buddhist monks have almost always been celibate. The Buddha was celibate. The monks around him were celibate. That doesn't mean they didn't have desires. Okay? A lot of the rules address the fact that you've got to be careful where you put yourself. I always use the example of the monk going behind the bush with a girl. And that has lots of ramifications. One, what are you doing behind a bush with a girl? Two, are you opening yourself to temptation? Are you looking around to see if anybody can see you so you can steal a kiss? Who knows? And of course we have the rule about giving the appearance of impropriety, giving the appearance of doing something wrong, even though you're not doing anything wrong. The appearance of doing wrong is really important. Don't give the appearance. Don't cause the other monks or the lay people to lose faith in you because you look like you're doing something wrong. Now, monks did things wrong. How do I know that? You don't need rules for people who don't do anything wrong. Like they instinctively and intuitively know that they shouldn't go and put their arm around a girl and kind of nuzzle her neck. Okay, well, all right, if you're supposed to be celibate, wouldn't that kind of tell you that, you got to be careful about this kind of stuff? I heard a story recently about a Vietnamese master. I don't know who it was. Nobody said names. I'm glad they didn't. But a Vietnamese friend of mine became very upset and distraught because she was around when this took place. And what happened was that a Vietnamese lady gave the Vietnamese monk a shoulder rub. Sounds pretty innocent, doesn't it? Well, it turned out to become more complicated than that. And it destroyed his reputation. And when a monk is considered apostate, when he no longer is respected, he's no longer supported. Nobody's going to bring him any food. Nobody's going to pay his gas bill. He's alone and he's destroyed, basically. So there are ramifications then and now. But yeah, monks goofed up, particularly young monks. They got into trouble and the Buddha we ended up with all these rules. And we have more than 250, by the way. Those are the only ones that are formalized. There are lots of rules as you read through the sutra. I remember when I was young and I realized that monks are supposed to sleep on their right side. We got a rule on how to sleep? Really? Yeah, they're supposed to sleep on their right side. Now, the Buddha, as far as I'm concerned, was an absolute genius, way beyond his time. Do you know why you should sleep on your right side? It puts the least amount of strain on your heart, and it opens up your lungs to take in the most air. Scientific fact. And the Buddha, well, he practiced yoga, right? He knew this, that sleeping, you know, it took me 6 months to stop sleeping on I used to sleep on my belly, which of course any good chiropractor, the battery ran out on this. So when it turns off, that's okay, just tell me to yell. Have we got the cheap batteries in here, or are we going over to the new batteries?
We got new batteries.
Right, don't worry about it, it's okay. I'll just get louder, just tell me to get louder if it turns off.
I think I can still hear you.
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah, it's just a red light just came on. We're looking for a monk who wants to dedicate his life to the PA system. Certainly not us. So in Japan, for the very longest time, they basically followed pretty much the same rules that monks all over the world followed. But around the 13th century, we had a phenomenon that took place. Now, there's a couple things that happened in Japan in the 13th century that are kind of important. One was that a master by the name of Eisai, who was a Tendai monk, and Saicho was a Tendai monk who came up with this Bodhisattva ordination, okay? And I mentioned it last time, I'll mention it again to refresh your memory. In the Tendai school it was a three-pronged practice. They did do meditation. They did study primarily the Lotus Sutra. And the third aspect of their practice was ceremony. They did perform a variety of ceremonies. Some maybe with a little bit of a magical intent. And so most of the monks you read about coming down to the 13th century, most of them were Tendai monks. Now there were Shingon monks and there were some other kinds of monks floating around, but most of them were Tendai. So we have a fellow by the name of, I just said his name and I'm having a senior moment. Whatever it was I just said, just refer to that. Eisai went to China as a Tendai monk, received transmission from the Lin-Chi school, which in Japan became the Rinzai school. And I don't know how they do that. They look at a Chinese character that meant Lin-Chi, and they come up with Rinzai. And I've never understood that. Someday, somebody that is very knowledgeable in languages will come in and explain how that keeps happening with everything.
Doesn't it mean just sitting?
Huh?
Does that just mean sitting, just sitting?
No, the Rinzai? No. Lin-Chi was the name of the man, the master. He's in our lineage because we carry the Japanese Rinzai lineage. Yeah, but actually we carry it through Vietnam. Lin-Chi, very important master. All the monks in China today have him in their lineage. But then it goes over to Japan and they say, Rinzai. Everybody's name gets changed in Japan. You know, Chao Chu became Joshu. Chao Chu, famous Zen master, becomes Joshu. How does that work? But there you go. So he goes there and he comes back and he never built or never established a Rinzai temple. But the Rinzai school looks at him as a very important monk because he brought the Rinzai practice, working with koans, public cases, problems for students to solve with their teacher. And he taught that until his death. Okay? Second important person was Dogen, Eihei Dogen, who goes with Eisai's #1 student, Myozen. They take a trip to China, and Dogen gets transmitted the Kaodong school, which is, in Japanese, is Soto. Kaodong, Soto. Give me a break. How does this keep happening? And he brings it back, and he does. He builds a Zen temple, Huanandel, and then later on he builds the big monastery Eiheiji out in Echizen, which is a county in Japan, and we look to Soto. Okay, within that time period, It was a very important time period for Buddhism in Japan because another monk came along who, me and names, that's why I write everything down. But he comes along and he starts the Pure Land School. And his close student establishes the true Pure Land School. And now we have an extreme leaving of tradition, because in the Pure Land School, much like Luther marrying a nun in Germany, and we have the beginning of one Protestant lineage in the world. Of course, other things were happening with Protestants who were breaking away from the Catholic Church. We have the same thing happen in Japan. Shinran, I think that's who it is, God, I'm getting old. He married a nun, and all of a sudden we have ministers, and the Japanese look at the Pure Land priests as ministers. They only wear the garbs of we would recognize as monks' robes during ceremonies. The rest of the time they would wear a nice suit. They didn't have to cut their hair. I don't know if they have to do it when they're in training, but I know that they never, when they come over here, they have a comb and they do their hair, and they took care of the Japanese population in America. By the way, the Chinese did bring monks over, up into San Francisco and the gold fields and things like that. Building the railroads, we had some Chinese monks come over. But this is a drastic departure. Nowhere else in the world do we have something like that happen. And it's a very much a devotional form of Buddhism. It's not exactly the same as Pure Land in China. Today in China, you're basically looking at a mixture of Pure Land and Zen. The most popular school in Vietnam is a mixture of Pure Land and Zen. And that is the lineage of this temple. We have a meditation hall, but we do chanting services, chant sutras, do ceremonies. It's an integral part of what we do. So that's in the 13th century. A lot going on in Japan. A lot of religious activity. Two great Zen masters lived within that 13th century. And here comes Shinran. And another really big thing happened. The warrior caste took over. They didn't eliminate the emperor. They just told the emperor, why don't you go and write poetry and have tea parties? And on occasion, we'll come and we'll get you to sign documents. But we think we're going to run Japan. And so we have what everybody in America, I think, is familiar with, the samurai. And the samurai had shoguns. And the shoguns were like the general in an army. That's basically what they were. And they divided up into Japan, into areas, and the shogun would be in charge, and he would have a number of these samurai, which are the Japanese equivalent of a European knight. And the shoguns were the equivalent of a baron over in Europe. And of course, there was an emperor, but, you know, they trotted him out every once in a while to do a ceremony or something. But basically, there was no power there. From the 13th century on. And then, I wrote the year down. No, I didn't. What's wrong with me? I thought I did. Wait a minute. I might have it on another piece of paper in here. For those that are checking out how historically correct I am. Or maybe I don't have it written down. I know you're waiting with bated breath to hear when this took place. It was right at the end of the 19th century, ready to go into the 20th century. It's been about 130 years back up. You see it was around 1890. Oh, yeah, okay. So what happened was Japan decided it was going to take over the world. And it was going to start by taking over Asia. And they started expanding out into Manchuria, Korea, China, but they didn't do it at this time. They just started thinking about it. And they thought, we are the biggest, baddest country in the world. We are a country of warriors. But in order to go out and get all the people behind us now, we've got to get the rank and file people. You know the guy out in the rice field 12 hours a day? That guy? We've got to get the merchants. We've got to get the guy that runs the railroad. We've got to get all these people involved. We think we ought to put the emperor back on the throne. And the emperor's name was Meiji. That was a family name, Meiji. And so the shoguns all got together and said, okay, we can only do this as a unified country. You know, it'd kind of be like the people in the United States said, we're going to go out and conquer the world. Texas, you go take that part. California, you take that part over there. Arizona, you don't have a lot of people. Just take that little thing in the Pacific, you know, and do it that. No, they wanted to do it as a unified effort. So they said, we're going to restore the emperor to the throne. And the name of that period, which we're still in, by the way, is called the Meiji Restoration. And these guys looked around, they said, all things Japanese are perfect. And I don't mean to offend anybody that's Japanese, although most American Japanese I don't think would be offended. And I can't imagine anybody in Japan watching me talking. But anyway, they decided we got to make things Japanese. It's the only way it's going to work. It's got to be completely Japanese. They said, first thing we got to do is get rid of Buddhism. Because Buddhism's not Japanese. You know, and they said, well, yeah, they came from Korea. And we're going to go stomp all over Korea sooner or later here. But then really it kind of came from China. Well, we're going to go invade China, which they did. And then somebody said, well, no, it's not even Chinese, it's Indian. Indian? You mean those dark people that live over there on that huge continent? Those people? Oh, well, what are we doing following a religion that started in that barbaric country? Said, we got to get rid of Buddhism. And so they went and told all the monks. Now, you have to understand, a long time ago, in Europe, churches were supported by the king, or the emperor, or the prince, or the duke, or the marquis, whoever was royalty. They supported, they're the only guys that had any money. Peasants, you know, they're lucky to have meat once a week. They didn't have any money to give to the church, so they were supported by the royalty. Same thing in Japan. All temples would get donations. Usually they got a donation of so many acres. They did it by rice crops or barley crops. And the emperor would donate the money from those crops, or give them the crops and they would sell it. It wasn't the lay people supporting things, it was the nobility. So the nobility said, we don't need Buddhism anymore because it's not a Japanese religion. Well, what is a Japanese religion? Well, they had a very primitive pantheistic religion known as Shinto. Very, very old religion. A very poetic religion in my book, because they would go out and they would say, hello, Mr. Tree, I hope you're doing well. Honestly, they believed that every living thing had a small god within them. Okay? Go look up some of European philosophy. We had some philosophers that were very comfortable with that idea. I'm very comfortable with the idea that everybody has Buddha nature. And if Buddha nature is God nature, then everybody has God nature. And if you want to argue about it, I haven't got time. But that's the way they looked at it. And they did beautiful things. They would go, every year they'd go out and hunt boar, you know, wild pigs. And they would first go out the day before, they'd get a Shinto priest to go out and bless the forest and apologize to the boar because they were going to go hunt them and have a feast. You know, if we did more of that kind of stuff, we'd probably have a softer heart. Yet these were people who were very warlike. So they said, we need to get rid of Buddhism. They told the monks, okay, we're not going to support you anymore. And by the way, since we're the only people that can carry a sword, we're telling you to close your temples. You don't get to do it anymore. And we're telling you what you do get to do. We're going to laicize you, an interesting term. That's what the communists did when they went, took over China. They laicized all the monks. Let your hair grow, go get a wife, you can eat meat. There was a strong prohibition against eating meat. One time they imported Koreans and other people to be butchers in Japan because a good Buddhist would never butcher meat. They'd eat it, but they didn't butcher the meat. So they said, yeah, just close it down, lock the doors, go get a wife, have some kids, grow your hair, have a big steak. But if you can't find a big steak, have a big halibut on me. That lasted for 5 years. And in that 5 years, most of the monks, they had no support. They had no income. They went out and started making their way through the world, figuring out something they could do. Most of them got married. And when you're married, you got a wife, and the temptation is there. And the next thing you know, we've got children. And then the lay people performed basically an insurrection. And they said to the shoguns, and they said to the samurai, and they said to the new emperor, who's now back on the throne, we're not really happy with this. What happened to our temples? What happened to our monks? What happened to the priests? What happened to the ceremonies? Where do we go to bury our dead? What are we going to do about weddings and all this? Now, while this is going on, they've got somebody writing a Bible for Shinto, because Shinto was a primitive religion. It never had any kind of writings. There was no philosophy involved. It was what do they call them? Anyway, God's everywhere. So they wrote a Bible, which nobody read, because they made it up, Okay, so we're a legitimate religion because we have this. And everybody's going, where are our monks? And the government said, okay, all right, relax. We don't need, a big insurrection here. We'll figure something out. And they went back to the monks and they said, okay, everybody wants you back. And they're really upset. And we're trying to get ready to dominate the world, and they're getting ready to rain on our parade. So we're going to let you come back to the temples. But we got a couple rules. One of the rules is that since traditionally schools were in all the temples, this same thing as medieval Europe. For the most part, there weren't separate schools. People went to learn to read and write, do arithmetic at temples, because the monks were pretty much the only people that could read. And so the wealthy sent their kids to the churches to be taught. And so they said, okay, you can teach the kids again, but you have to teach them that the emperor is the Son of God. And I know you all know, you probably don't, because I never heard Gloria Steinem say anything about it, but the Japanese God is a woman. If you didn't know that, now you know. They believe the sun is God. That's why their flag has a sun on it, and it's a she. So even though they look like they're misogynists, they still had a woman God. And they said, you have to teach that the emperor is the Son of God. And, just perfect in every way. And you have to support that. And you have to basically spread propaganda for what we're doing. And the monks said, okay. Because the only way you really ever get anything done is compromise. If you take a hard line, you just end up having a war. Kind of like what's going on in Washington right now, A little compromise would be good. So the monks came back in, and an interesting phenomenon took place, 110 years ago, is that all the different denominations set up universities or colleges. And every denomination you can mention that they have there has their own school, own university. And most education's always been important for Buddhist monks, always. Most Buddhist monks in the world today have a college degree of some sort, if they can afford to do it. And so things changed. Well, okay, they're back in the temples. They have to teach school to the kids, no problem, they were doing it anyway. They have to tell the kids, You have to honor the emperor, bow to the emperor. They'd have a picture of the emperor. Kind of like having a picture of the Queen in England, you know, and you'd bow to it when you came into the room. Well, what about those wives? What about those kids that are playing around at their feet now? What about this whole thing? Do you see? Most of these monks never ate any meat. They didn't have to give up meat to become a monk. At one time in Japan, good Buddhists did not eat meat or fish. You know, they don't eat a lot of meat there today because it's so expensive, but they eat a lot of fish. Well, Pandora's box was opened. And today, I estimate, and I have no scientific proof except everything I've ever read, I estimate that 90% of the Soto Zen priests in Japan, Soto is the second largest school in Japan. The first is at Pure Land. They're all married. You know, they're like Luther. The center of the church is the family. So all the Jodo Shin is married. And then we have the Soto. Easily 90% of them are married and have families and a wife, a long-suffering wife, by the way, because these monks, none of these monks are rich. They're still traditional Buddhist monks in that they have very little income, whatever might be donated to them specifically. And then Rinzai, I don't know what the percentages are with the Rinzai. I know most of the great Rinzai masters in the last 100 years have usually not been married, have devoted themselves to training the monks. But there's certainly the ones that came here were married. So, is anybody else in the Buddhist world married? Well, I have a student who I haven't seen in a long time. Maybe he'll see this talk and go, oh, I need to correct what he's saying there. He's quite a scholar. I have a great deal of respect for him. And we have a gathering of people that have studied with me or who are studying with me. Normally every April, they come together for between 7 and 9 days and we have a retreat. And I have the older monks teach the younger monks. I do a little bit of the teaching, I have them teach each other. And he's very much a scholar, got himself a PhD and all of that. And the first year we had this gathering, I asked him to talk about Korean tradition, because he started in the Korean tradition before he came to me, and was fully ordained and everything, had many, many students. And he explained to us that in Korea today, that 40% of the monks there are married, and 60% are not. Okay? And he did make a disclaimer. He said, he did not think that it was the Japanese influence. I still think it was. When the Japanese went in there for so long, and all the priests were married and they brought their families. And you have to understand, when the Japanese went into Korea, they told the Koreans they had a better form of Buddhism. Therefore, the Koreans should be practicing Japanese Buddhism. So I think that was a big influence. But he said, you know, throughout the history of Korea, there were monks who were married. I don't doubt that. I think that's probably true because they're human beings. You know, it's never monolithic. People are confused in this country. They think anybody in Tibetan robes is celibate. I don't know of a single American. Now I'm talking about America and America right now. Pema Chodron might be the exception, except that Pema Chodron did her ordination in Hong Kong or Shanghai or something like that. But I'm sure she's celibate. But but Pema Chodron doesn't present herself as Lama Pema Chodron. She presents herself as a Tibetan monk who could not ordain in Tibet because Tibet's never had nuns. Never had, and you're only really a nun or a monk when you're fully ordained. We call them half monks in our tradition. Half monk is a novice. Well, if they put Lama in front of their name, that means they went through some really strict training. And all the ones I know that live in this country are married and have children and do pretty much whatever they feel like doing because they're not bound by the rules of a monk. And at one time when Tibet, about half of the men in Tibet, that's an estimate, half of the men in Tibet were monks. Half of those monks weren't monks, they were lamas, and they had families. So wrap your head around that. And I'm sure that would bring out, if a Theravadan ever watched this talk, they'd go, see, I told you. I told you. We're in the last stage of existence and the end of the world is coming soon. But
The end of the Dharma, they say.
But I personally feel that this is why Zen has been so attractive to people in America. It's been attractive to Europeans, but I think it's part of the reason why is because there are no restrictions like that in Zen today. They come over here, and since it's common for them to be married over there, you know, some of the famous people like Suzuki Roshi, who wrote Zen, didn't write it, he talked Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, had a big influence, San Francisco Zen Center. He was married, you know, and Maizumi Roshi, who started the LA Zen Center, a very important place, he was married. And Katagiri Roshi, who started Minneapolis Zen Center, as far as I know, he was married. And so you get all of these very important teachers, they're married. And so when an American looks at taking the road, they go, well, shoot, what do I have to give up? You know, and that's fodder for another talk at another time. But that is where we are now. Now, in the Vietnamese tradition, I know of a couple of monks that are married. They are not supported by the Vietnamese community. Okay? The youth, some of the Vietnamese youth support them now. This is old knowledge. I'm talking about things that I learned, people I met 40 years ago. They're on the East Coast. I knew one fellow, he was a cousin of one of my teachers. He studied in Japan, came back, started a temple. He and his wife were social workers. For a long time, that was the only money that came into that temple, because the older Vietnamese just could not accept the idea of a married monk. And I understand it. You know, culture is a huge thing to deal with. And so, why was he doing that? Well, because he'd studied in a Rinzai temple in Japan for a number of years. And that's the way things go for the Japanese. So, Franciscans, well, deacons can be married. As a matter of fact, a lot of deacons in the Catholic Church are married. And they can do almost everything. Almost everything, but not everything that a priest can do. And I have a friend who I unfortunately have not seen in a long time. We used to go out to the prison on Wednesday nights. We have a very large federal prison complex. And he was hurt severely during the Vietnam War and had 100% disability, and asked his wife if it was okay for him to dedicate his life to the church, because he did have a full disability payment every month. And so he became a deacon to the Indians down and around San Diego, and he would come to the prison once a week with me, and he was Deacon Frank. And at that time, the Catholic Church was just started looking at supporting their deacons, because typically a deacon got no financial support. Everything was a gift that they did. The Catholic Church needed more people to help, and I'm told that they started giving some money to the deacons so they could work.
His friends are showing up.
His friends showing up. Well, it's all over with. Hallelujah. Okay? So, did Miss Lam bring some soup?
She said she would bring something today, yes.
Yeah, well, I didn't
I'm
know
not
if
sure.
she...
I hadn't
didn't see her.
seen anything.
Well, we have to look in the refrigerator to see if she snuck up last night. Okay?
Right.
So, thank you, and please offer incense, and we may or may not have lunch.
We will have tea and crackers.
We could have tea and crackers. You gotta ring the bell a couple times.